Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on coaching for students. My name is Duncan Partridge, and I am CEO of EdUse Mentoring and Coaching. We're an organisation that works with schools and other organisations around the world on providing coaching and mentoring services for teachers, for school leaders. And in recent times, we've been finding that more and more schools have been expressing an interest in transferring some of the coaching techniques and approaches that we've been using with them to their students. And this short webinar today is to give you a taste of some of the things that you can do with your students to help them overcome the types of issues that often hold them back in their learning. So, launching straight in, there are lots of challenges that students face on a day-to-day basis. Many of these will be familiar to you, and there may be some more here that students in your school experience on a regular basis. And all of these challenges are ones that a coaching approach can work with. I put emphasis on the word can because a coaching approach won't always work. And one thing that I will say immediately up front is that if you're going to use coaching with students in your school, it needs to be something that you commit to, not only as an individual teacher, but that your school is committed to as well. The potential transformative effects of using coaching with students come from an institution-wide approach. So if you and your colleagues are adopting a consistent approach to supporting students with their challenges and using this coaching approach to help them take some control of the challenges that they're facing, then that's where the potential lies. Similarly, of course, coaching has the potential to have impact on professional development with you and your colleagues, with the idea being that if a school is investing in training, etc., for their staff, a coaching approach can help embed that further. But today we're focusing on students. So here are some challenges that students often face. The idea of transition, often from primary setting to a secondary setting, the workload that they have to deal with, deadlines, exams, and one that comes up time and time again, the idea that students are having problems with getting started on work. And of course, there's one additional factor that we have to take into account at the moment: the struggles that students often have with distance learning and everything else that exists around the pressures and strains of what we're living through, what we're all living through at the moment. So what are some of the skills or some of the qualities that we want students to be able to develop in order to help them meet these challenges? Well, there are a few there, and again, there'll be many more that you can think of, but I think these are really, really key ones. Many of them are interrelated. We hear a lot of talk about resilience, the idea of students being able to cope with things not going well and to bounce back, the idea of perseverance, the idea of keeping going and having that stamina to keep going, being committed to their learning, having confidence, and very closely related to that, seeing themselves as efficacious, seeing themselves as learners who can achieve. And again, coaching done well, done strategically, has the potential to develop these qualities in students. So, what is coaching for students? Well, it's multifaceted. And here we've got three ways that coaching for students can be delivered. There's the one-to-one situation with a teacher and a student. There is a group teacher situation where a teacher is working with a group of students who may be having similar challenges. And then an additional one that doesn't occur immediately to everybody is the idea of one-to-one student coaching, and I'll be talking more about all of those approaches as we go through this webinar this afternoon. So what are some of the features of coaching for students? Well, one of the features that characterizes coaching in all its forms and facets is the idea of using questioning to encourage insight. In other words, using those questions to help students think differently about things, to give them a different perspective, to give them space to understand the challenges that they're facing in a slightly different way. Active listening, again, is a very, very important part of any approach to coaching. And the idea of active listening is the idea of going beyond the words and asking questions that come from that ability to be able to read between the lines, I suppose, when you're listening to what a student has to say to you. Challenge is really important in any coaching situation. The idea that in order to improve, in order to develop, we sometimes need to be challenged, but that word supportive is really important as well. Coaching is all about trust, whether it be in an executive setting or whether it be with students, and that challenge needs to be challenge that feels safe for the student and is delivered in an appropriate way by the person who is doing the coaching. All coaching is goal-oriented. It's not about going round and round in circles, navel-gazing, as some people would have it. It's about trying to achieve outcomes. And this is why I often say that the perception that sometimes exists of coaching as being woolly is completely wrong. If it's being done correctly, it will be very much about goals, and it will be successful if those goals are being achieved. And those goals have to be easily accessible, so we know that they're being achieved. And it needs to be something that has a tangible outcome for the person involved in it. Another a myth, I suppose, about coaching that exists is that it's all about open-ended questioning. And I disagree with that profoundly, especially when we're talking about coaching students. Giving advice and support is something that all teachers do with their students, and we're not talking about taking that out of the equation. We're not talking about that being something that teachers should stop doing. Their expertise, their knowledge is always going to be important. But what we're trying to do with coaching for students is to get a balance so that the students start to take some responsibility themselves for any issues or challenges that they are facing. And it's only that way that those sort of independence skills can be developed, and they can start to apply those in a range of different settings, with obviously potentially positive benefits for their wider learning and their attainment. And another feature of coaching for students, which I'll touch on today, is the idea of taking approaches, techniques from cognitive behavioural therapy and applying them in coaching. Again, it's really, really important to say here that we're not talking about cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, as it's often known. That is clearly something that is the domain of professionals, of psychologists, suitably qualified people. But there are techniques that come from CBT that can be used to help students think differently about themselves. And again, important to stress here that this type of approach does not work if it's seen as a sort of a light touch, one-off type of exercise whereby students are, we're going to do some CBT today, we're going to do some CBC today, and then that's it. It has to be something that's embedded and ingrained and that students come back to, in the same way that somebody who is going through therapy will need to do hard work in order to be able to see the benefits. So let's come to one common framework that's used within many different coaching settings. There are lots of different coaching frameworks. I don't necessarily always use this one, but I find that it's a particularly useful one to use with students because of its simplicity more than anything else. So you can see it's got a nice acronym, as most of these frameworks do. This one is GROW. And it starts with the idea that the students, with the help and support of a teacher, define the goal. something that they want to get better in and what they want to achieve. Some time looking at, okay, that's your goal. Where are you now? What is going well? What isn't going well? What's holding you back? Then coming on to the O part, that's the listing or the brainstorming of, okay, what sorts of things could you do here? And again, I'm going to jump in here and say that at this point, this is where teachers can input as well, because teachers have lots of experience with students who might have had similar problems or challenges and have come up with ideas or seen ways of working that help those students. So it would be appropriate to share those at this particular time, but not to the extent that the student doesn't have the ability to actually come up with their own ideas themselves. And very, very important part of coaching with students is about the idea of personal responsibility and trying to ensure that students have a sense of control over how they develop as students. And then lastly, the W is, okay, we've listed all these possibilities, these options, so what are you going to do now? And again, it's really important here to say that this is not just a one-off event where a teacher works with a student or a group of students and they go through this model and then that's it. And the students then sort of take control of it. The power comes from the returning to it and the talking about, okay, what's gone well, what are the challenges, using coaching type questions in order to take the process even further. And it's only with that that the real power comes. So let's look at an example scenario of how a GROW approach to coaching with students might pan out. So I've got an imaginary student who is not very good at submitting work on time. Her teacher has noticed that she has become more and more disengaged in the lessons, and the teacher arranges to meet with the student. Now, often in these sorts of circumstances, the teacher will express their concern, will say to the student, these are the things that you need to get better at. Please go away and work on these things. But coaching and the use of the GROW framework offers a different approach to that. So when we're looking at the goal part of the framework, the teacher might ask, okay, so what is it you think you need to get better at? What do you think are the challenges that you're facing? Can you think of a goal that's related to this? And then that last one, and this isn't an exhaustive list of questions, these are just examples, but that last one I think is a really, really important one, because what it's important to do with coaching is to try and get students or whoever is being coached to look positively at the future, to look at what can be obtained and what it will feel like when it is obtained. So what it will be like, what will it be like for you when you achieve that goal is an important type of question to be using with students. And then you come to the R part of the framework, which is, okay, let's look at some of the things that you've done already. Tell me about what you've already tried out. Has any of that worked particularly well? And then that last question, or that type of question is important as well, because it's then you can start to get into, okay, what might be the challenges, what might be the issues here. So what has held you back might be another question. And then you come to this part where it's looking at, okay, what are the possibilities here? What can be done in order to try and overcome these challenges, to try and resolve the problems that you've been having? So what can you do to help you achieve your goal? And then that's not a typo, those two what else is there. And again, this is quite an important part of what coaching is about. It's the digging and digging and digging element of it. Okay, so what else could you do? Is there anything else? Is there anything else? And sometimes it's the last thing that they come up with after a long, painful pause that is the breakthrough moment. And again, I'm going to say here in the options part, it's very likely with some students, especially early in the process when students are becoming used to coaching as a way of working, that you will offer advice at these stages. In many coaching settings, coaches will ask permission to ask advice. That's not obligatory with students. I find it can be quite powerful. I noticed that you're struggling to come up with some ideas here. May I make a couple of suggestions? May I make a suggestion? Because that sort of language helps the student still feel in control of the situation. And of course, they have the capacity to say, no, thank you. Not many of them will, but they do have that capacity. But again, my experience is that as students become more and more familiar with this model and this way of working, the need to do that becomes less and less. Of course, they're novices, they're young people, so they might not actually have the experience or the knowledge to actually come up with ideas themselves, and that's where you come in. But sometimes you'll be surprised by their ability to be able to resolve the situations themselves. And then lastly, okay, so here's that list. So what are the things you're going to try out? And that last one is, again, a really, really important type of question to ask, because it helps create a commitment. It helps it helps the student go away with the notion of, okay, this is something that I've said I'm going to do. They won't always do it. And again, realism is really, really important here. But as practice and as the way of working becomes more and more ingrained, it's more likely that they will go away and do what they've said to do. Now, again, I think it's important to say here that when you have the follow-up meetings with students, in pure coaching terms, it's important not to take a punitive approach if the student comes back and they say, I'm sorry, I didn't do it. And again, in executive coaching situations, and I've experienced this many times, very, very high-powered people will come back and hold up their hand and say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do it. And my response in those situations will always be, well, that's your responsibility. Let's have a look at why that might have happened. Let's try and explore what made you stop doing it. And of course, procrastination, we talked about at the start, is a challenge that many students will have. But rather than a sort of a blame approach, if a student is not moving forward in the way that they're committed to, take a more exploratory approach to try and find, okay, what's holding you back, and what have been the reasons for you not taking it forward in the same way you wanted to. I'm aware of time ticking by, so I'm going to touch on this very, very briefly. This is an example from a school in Hong Kong that adopted a coaching approach across the school in terms of professional development for teachers, but also with students as well. And they use coaching for feedback. So when a teacher is feeding back to a student on an assignment, a piece of work that they're doing, they're using that coaching framework in order to feed back to them. So asking them questions about, okay, what did you notice about how you did? What did you like about it? Can I tell you what I think you did well? Can I tell you what I think was good about your piece of work? And then you come on to that development part of it. Okay, what might you do differently next time? What will that look like? And then you have that opportunity to make those suggestions yourself. It's when you're giving that feedback as a teacher. But the student has the time and space to reflect themselves on the piece of work that they're doing. And again, that idea of digging, that idea of tell me more, anything else, leaving that space for students to really, really think deeply and do hard thinking about what it is that they can improve in. And here's just a quote from one year 10 student in that particular school. And then another example of coaching is peer coaching. And this is a project, a piece of work that was done by an Australian organisation called Growth Coaching International. And they set up peer coaching in a number of both elementary and secondary schools in Australia. They trained students to be coaches and then looked at the results through feedback from all the participants. And these are some of the things that were noticed as outcomes of this particular project. So there was more confidence in the students, that the students used coaching in a wider setting than just purely academic settings, that the students felt that they had greater ownership of their learning and decision making. Interesting one about confidence in talking to people. And they were also able to make links between coaching and their development of skills such as empathy, self-management, etc. And then with teachers, they saw that coaching with peer coaching helped them in terms of their own teaching practice, and indeed improve their relationships with students. And then lastly, looking at the impact that it had on culture within the school. I said earlier about the importance of, if you're going to use coaching, then it shouldn't be a light touch. It has to be something that the school commits to as a whole. And again, it's important to say here that coaching isn't for everyone. So there has to be that commitment at a senior leadership level, and indeed that ability to be able to support the whole staff through the process of change, which is often the reality of introducing coaching, because it's very different from what's gone on before. And that it became the philosophy in learning for all, and teaching also benefited from it. And here are a few things that some of the students said that were involved in it. These are interesting because they're not necessarily directly related to academics, and there's sort of interesting side effects of being involved in coaching. So Katie says that she actually feels better about herself when she's been coaching somebody, which is positive in itself. James says that he's thinking differently about things. He's having a different perspective as a result of being involved in peer coaching. And then lastly, Charlotte, who says, I don't know if I'm actually any better at the work that I've been doing, but I'm looking at it differently. I'm much clearer about the processes that are involved in it, and I'm definitely calmer. Now that's really interesting. And again, when we come on to the section on using cognitive behavioural techniques, that's something that's really important. And here we are at cognitive behavioural coaching. So you may or may not be familiar with CBT. It's something that's been common currency in therapy for a number of years now, and there's a lot of research about the positive impact that CBT has. But it's only more recently that there's been a recognition that cognitive behavioural techniques can be useful outside a therapy setting. And that's particularly the case with students. And I'm going to be doing a session in a couple of weeks' time on specifically cognitive behavioural coaching, and there'll be details of that at the end of this particular session if you're interested. So this is just going to be a very, very light touch introduction to that. So the idea behind cognitive behavioural coaching or therapy is this triangle you can see here. The fact that we have thoughts about things that happen to us. We have thoughts about ourselves, and we talk to ourselves in such a way. And these thoughts generate feelings, emotions, which manifest themselves in behaviours, what we actually do. And the idea of cognitive behavioural coaching or therapy is that you can start to work on changing those thoughts that quite often are ingrained. And those of you who know about cognitive science will know that once something becomes a mindset that is set within a person, it becomes very difficult to change it. But it can be changed, but it needs hard work to be changed. And if you can change those thoughts about yourself and about situations, then you can change the way you react to them, and therefore you change behaviors. And again, it's important to say here that when you're using cognitive behavioural coaching with students, that the concept of CBC is actually made explicit to the students. It shouldn't be something that is done undercover, so to speak, because the power comes from them knowing the process. It's metacognition. It's the idea of students actually being able to think about how their thoughts and how their brain works, and be able to understand the techniques that can be applied to be able to shift that and to be able to change that. So just again, this is sort of what I'd said already, that basically you will start by identifying, okay, what is lying at the root of the issue that you're having? What sorts of emotions, feelings is this generating, and how is that holding you back? And what are some practical solutions? And another feature of it, as I said earlier, is that the beliefs that students have are often based on inaccurate perceptions of themselves and of situations, and of faulty cognition. In other words, thinking that comes about as a result of the way that they've thought about for a long time, and it becomes set, the neural pathways are established, and CBC is about changing those pathways, changing the way that they think about themselves. Lots of you will be familiar with the idea of deliberate practice with students, and it's now very much the case that it's seen as being a really important part of pedagogy and an effective approach to learning with students. The idea that by identifying an area that a student needs to improve in, by giving them support and guidance to go away and to work on that, to get feedback on it, and then go back to it again and go around in that circle, that practice that's deliberate and focused and incremental based on the feedback is hugely powerful in terms of positively impacting learning. And really, CBC uses exactly the same idea, the idea approach, that students have particular things that they want to get better at, or they want to think differently about, or that they have established has been holding them back, and they need to be able to change in order to move forward. Then they find ways, that you give them ways of being able to break those ideas down, break those perceptions down. You feed back to them on how they are implementing them, and then the whole sort of cycle starts again. And again, in the course that I'll be doing in a couple of weeks' time, I should be going through a lot of different actual techniques and strategies that you can use with students in order to help them think differently about themselves and about themselves as learners in order to improve the outcomes that they achieve. And here's just one model that can be used with students. And again, there are a number, and no one is better than another. It's really a case of just finding one that works and that students can become familiar with. So, nice, easy to remember title, ABCDE model. So the idea there is that there's something that happens that induces stress in the student, or makes them engage in certain thought patterns that makes them think negative thoughts. So with an ABCD model, what you'll do with the student is actually work with them to identify what is the nature of those activating events. Okay, what is it that happens that makes you feel this way? Is there a pattern here? Is there something that triggers you when you go into shutdown mode when you're presented with a piece of work? So what is that activating event? And then going on to explore, okay, so what are the beliefs that lie behind it? And this is an important element of this model, the idea that students have certain sort of beliefs about themselves that are often limiting beliefs. What are those beliefs that you have about yourself that leads to you feeling in this particular way? And what are the consequences of this? What happens when you are in this particular situation? As I said earlier, maybe they shut down, maybe that, and they can't get on with the work. And all of that is a part of them understanding themselves, not so much as learners, but as human beings. We all have these thought processes, we all have these ways of thinking, and it helps give them insight into themselves. And then the last two, the D and the E, is when you start to actually challenge those beliefs with students. And again, there are a lot of activities, there are a lot of approaches to help students be able to begin to question some of those sometimes very deeply held beliefs about themselves. So you're disputing those, you're finding ways to get them to challenge those often completely irrational self-perceptions that they have in themselves. And then lastly, okay, so what are the effects of you thinking differently about this? What is happening as a result of this? And again, all of this can be done through a training type approach, really. It's a range of different activities and approaches that students can be encouraged to use to help them think differently about themselves. Okay. So what pitfalls and problems are there? Well, firstly, time is the big thing. I mean, everything that I've talked about now is going to need time to be created for either the peer coaching or the one-on-one coaching. And I'm very aware that this is the eternal challenge within schools. What I can say is that those schools that have managed to make it work have actually decided, okay, this is so important that we're actually going to create time. And maybe it means doing less of something else. And I'm a great believer in not feeling that you should continue to fill the pot until the whole thing boils over, which again is why coaching isn't necessarily always for everybody. So it's time can be created if there's that commitment to making it happen, and across the staff, that shared enthusiasm about the potential that the coaching has to improve student well-being and performance. Another potential pitfall is that, as I said earlier, we as teachers are not therapists. We are not doctors, we're not psychologists. And it's really important that there's a very, very clear division between using cognitive behavioural approaches for coaching and for therapy. And it's really important that that is made very, very clear. And then lastly, and this is from the wonderful Steve Peters' Chimp Paradox series of books, the limbic system within teenagers is particularly active and much more developed than many other areas of the brain at that particular age. And it's that particular part of the brain that helps generate those negative thoughts, that self-talk that might be disparaging. And so it's hard work, maybe harder work than it is with adults, where that part of the brain, the impact or the influence of that part of the brain has been balanced out by development of other parts of the brain. Doesn't mean it's undoable, but it does mean that it's hard work, and that means that that approach, that commitment is even more important. And next slide is going to say questions. No, it's not. Sorry. This just very, very nearly finally. This is taken from the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit, which most, if not all of you, will be very, very familiar with. And I've taken out 3 high impact techniques or approaches that the EEF have defined, all of which obviously have very, very close affiliation with what we've been talking about today, coaching, the idea of feedback to students, the idea of students understanding themselves as learners and regulating themselves, and the idea of peer tutoring. All of those can be part of should be part of a school-wide approach to coaching for students, and the evidence around the impact on wider student learning is there. And obviously that needs to be taken into account as well in terms of making decisions about whether it's not for you as a school. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but if you do have any questions, my email address is down in the bottom right-hand corner there, along with email addresses for Dragonfly training. Lastly, just a few things that I've got coming up over the next few weeks. And please feel free to get in touch with me, or indeed Dragonfly Training, about any of those. At Educe, we also offer one-on-one coaching and mentoring services for teachers and for school leaders. We have a new scheme that we've just launched called Pay It Forward Coaching, where leaders and teachers in independent schools can avail themselves of our services and help subsidise coaching for colleagues in the state sector and make it accessible to them financially, which is often a barrier for involvement. So, as I say, do get in touch if you have any questions, and thank you very much for listening today.